Her father called her a burden. Cowboy said, "You're worth more than all his land." Words that cut like a knife, yet healed with unexpected kindness. A story of rejection and redemption unfolding across the vast plains, where family legacy and true worth collide. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Mary Johnson clutched her worn leather satchel against her chest, feeling the rough texture through her thin cotton dress. Her father's cruel words echoed relentlessly in her mind. "You've been nothing but a burden since your mother passed." The sting of that sentence burned like a hot iron as she trudged along the dusty road, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known, deep in the Colorado territory of 1878. The sun beat down mercilessly on her uncovered head. She'd left in such haste that her bonnet remained hanging by the kitchen door, another small piece of herself abandoned at the Johnson Ranch. Mary blinked back tears, refusing to give her father the satisfaction of her sorrow, even if he couldn't see it. At 20 years old, she had spent her entire life trying to earn William Johnson's approval. She'd cooked, cleaned, mended, and worked the fields alongside the men when needed. Yet nothing ever seemed enough for the man who had grown increasingly bitter with each passing season. Her mother's death 5 years ago had hollowed him out, leaving only a shell filled with resentment and harsh judgment. Their small ranch had been struggling for years. The soil grew poorer each season, and the cattle thinner. This year's devastating drought had been the final blow, not just to their livelihood, but to her father's already fragile temperament. Mary had watched him change day by day, his disappointment calcifying into something harder and more dangerous. "Get out!" he had roared that morning, his face contorted with rage after she'd accidentally broken their last good pitcher. "I fed you, clothed you, and what do I get in return? Nothing but misfortune." Mary paused on the road, adjusting the satchel that contained everything she now owned in the world: a spare dress, her mother's tattered Bible, a small pouch with $3.17, and the pocket knife her mother had insisted every woman should carry. The weight seemed both insignificant and overwhelming. She glanced back once, watching the small ranch house disappear behind a gentle rise in the landscape. The home where she'd been born, where she'd learned to walk and talk, where she'd held her mother's hand as she slipped away, all of it vanishing like morning mist. Ahead lay Silver Creek, a small but growing town where she hoped to find work. Mary squared her shoulders and quickened her pace. She was William Johnson's daughter, after all, and if nothing else, he had taught her endurance. She would survive this too. Why keep another mouth to feed when you bring only bad luck? William Johnson's words cut through the air like a knife as he tossed Mary's belongings onto the wooden porch. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, deepening the lines of frustration etched there over years of hardship. Mary Johnson stood frozen, clutching her mother's silver hairbrush, the only keepsake she had left of the woman who'd once softened her father's hard edges. The drought had withered their crops for the second season, and with each passing day, her father's bitterness had grown like the cracks in their parched fields. "Father, please," she whispered, but William turned away, his shoulders rigid with resolve. "You had your chance," he muttered. "David Martins offered good money for you, a widower with his own land willing to take you, and you refused him out of pure stubbornness." Mary shuddered at the thought of David Martins. A neighbor was at least 45, with 3 wild children and hands that seemed to find excuses to brush against her whenever they crossed paths at church socials. His first wife had died under circumstances the town still whispered about, though never within his hearing. "He's old enough to be my father," Mary protested, gathering her courage. "And his reputation—" "His reputation?" William spun around, eyes flashing. "At least he has land that produces. At least he can feed his family. What have you brought but expenses and trouble since your mother died?" The accusation stung worse than any physical blow. Since her mother's passing 5 years ago, Mary had cooked, cleaned, and managed their modest home without complaint. She'd even learned bookkeeping to help with the ranch accounts, though her father rarely acknowledged her efforts. "I've worked every day to help this family," she said, her voice trembling. "And what good has it done?" William gestured toward their failing fields. "Look around you. Everything's dying. Your mother was the lucky one, leaving before she had to see what's become of us." Mary gasped at the cruelty of his words. Her father had changed so much since they'd buried her mother. Beneath the old oak tree, the gentle man who once read to her by lamplight had vanished, replaced by this hollow-eyed stranger consumed by grief and failure. As she gathered her scattered belongings, Mary realized the truth. Her refusal to marry David Martins had merely provided the excuse her father needed. In his eyes, she had become a burden, another mouth to feed when resources were scarce. Her usefulness had been measured and found wanting. Silver Creek shimmered like a mirage in the distance, its faint outlines wavering in the afternoon heat. Mary Johnson fixed her gaze on that promise of civilization, where Mrs. Wilson's boarding house represented her only chance at employment. She had met the kindly woman just once, at the county fair last summer, when her father had been in one of his rare sociable moods. The memory of Mrs. Wilson, Wilson's gentle eyes and warm handshake had left an impression that now felt like a lifeline. "Just 5 more miles," she whispered to herself, adjusting the worn leather satchel that held everything she now owned, and her throat was parched, the single canteen of water nearly empty after hours of walking. Mary paused to rest beneath the sparse shade of a lone cottonwood tree. As she leaned against its rough bark, her thoughts drifted to the boarding house. Would Mrs. Wilson remember her? Would there truly be work available for a young woman with no references except her own word? The alternative, sleeping outdoors with no protection, was too frightening to contemplate. The sudden sound of approaching hooves broke through her worried thoughts. Mary's heart leaped into her throat as dust rose from the road ahead. Travelers in these parts could mean anything, help or harm, and a woman alone had every reason to be cautious. She quickly stepped off the dirt road and into the tall grass, her fingers instinctively finding her mother's old pocket knife in her dress pocket. The knife was small but sharp, its bone handle smooth from years of use. Her mother had carried it for protection and practical needs alike, and had pressed it into Mary's hands on her deathbed 7 years ago. "A woman needs something of her own," she had whispered. Now Mary gripped it tightly, knuckles white with tension as the rider drew closer. She crouched lower in the grass, making herself as small as possible. The hoofbeats slowed, and Mary held her breath. Had she been spotted? The rider was a man, that much she could see, tall in the saddle of a magnificent chestnut horse. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but something about his posture seemed more curious than threatening. "Hello?" the stranger called out, his deep voice carrying across the open space. "Is someone there?" Mary remained frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give away her position. The stranger reined his horse to a complete stop, scanning the landscape with keen eyes. A deep voice called out, "Miss, are you all right out here alone?" Mary looked up, startled by the sudden interruption. A tall man sat astride a powerful chestnut horse, his face partially shaded by a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his features. The stranger's posture was relaxed, yet alert, one hand resting casually on his saddle horn, while the other held the reins with practiced ease. As he tilted his head, sunlight caught his face, revealing a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes as blue as the summer sky. He appeared young, perhaps 25, with shoulders broadened by years of physical labor. "I'm fine, sir," Mary replied, forcing herself to stand a little straighter despite her exhaustion. She gripped her mother's pocket knife tighter in her pocket, a reflexive gesture of protection. The prairie stretched empty in all directions, making her acutely aware of her vulnerability. "Just on my way to Silver Creek." The stranger's gaze swept over her dusty dress, lingering on her worn leather satchel clutched protectively against her chest. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with judgment, but with concern. The meager nature of her belongings told a story she wasn't ready to share. "That's quite a journey on foot," he observed, his voice carrying a gentle tone that contrasted with his imposing presence. "These roads can be dangerous for a woman traveling alone." Mary swallowed hard, fighting the urge to look away. The last thing she needed was pity from a stranger, no matter how genuine his concern seemed. "I can manage, thank you," she answered, her mother's lessons in propriety warring with her instinct for caution. The horse shifted beneath the rider, its coat gleaming copper in the afternoon sun. Mary noticed the quality of the animal's tack and the man's well-worn but decent clothing. Signs he wasn't some drifter, but likely a local rancher or businessman. "I don't doubt your capability, miss," he said with a slight smile that softened his features. "But Silver Creek is still 8 miles ahead, and the sun won't stay up much longer." Mary hesitated, weighing her limited options. Her father's harsh words still rang in her ears, reminding her that she was alone in the world now. Yet something about this stranger's steady gaze made her pause rather than hurry away. "That's a long way to walk," he said, dismounting with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. The stranger fell into step beside Mary, leading his chestnut horse by the reins. The animal's coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, well-groomed and clearly valuable. "My name's Robert Brown. I own the Double B Ranch north of Silver Creek." Mary's heart sank. The Double B was one of the more prosperous properties in the territory. Of course he would know her father. Everyone within 50 miles knew William Johnson and his failing ranch. She tightened her grip on her worn leather satchel, bracing herself for the inevitable questions. "Johnson's daughter, right?" Robert asked, his brow furrowed beneath the wide brim of his hat. His blue eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, though not in the way David Martin's gaze had. Mary nodded stiffly, waiting for the judgment to follow. Her father had borrowed from nearly everyone in the county, paid back few, and complained about the rest. She prepared herself for the usual comments about William's debts or his drinking. Robert simply shook his head, surprising her. "Your father's a proud man, sometimes too proud for his own good." The gentle assessment caught Mary off guard. Most folks weren't so charitable when discussing William Johnson these days. "You know him well?" she asked cautiously, studying the rancher from the corner of her eye. Robert Brown looked to be in his mid-20s, with a strong jaw and shoulders that suggested regular physical labor despite his ownership status. "Well enough," he replied, guiding his horse around a rut in the dirt road. "Helped him round up strays last spring when the creek flooded. He wouldn't take payment, though I could see he needed it." That sounded like her father, refusing charity even when desperation clawed at their door. Pride had always been William Johnson's downfall. Mary wondered if Robert knew just how bad things had gotten at their ranch, or why she was walking alone toward Silver Creek with everything she owned clutched against her chest. The young rancher seemed to read something in her silence. He adjusted his hat and cleared his throat. "Forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, but it's unusual to see a young woman traveling alone in these parts, especially on foot." Mary kept her eyes fixed on the dusty path ahead. The last thing she wanted was this stranger's pity, no matter how kind his manner seemed to be. They walked side by side along the dusty Colorado Trail, the only sounds between them the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional snort from Robert Brown's chestnut horse. Mary kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, acutely aware of the stranger beside her. Though he seemed kind, experience had taught her that kindness often came with conditions. After several minutes of companionable silence, Robert cleared his throat. "May I ask why you're out here alone, Miss Johnson? These roads aren't safe for a young woman traveling without escort." Something in his tone, genuine concern without judgment, made Mary glance up. His blue eyes held steady, patient. Unlike her father's perpetually disappointed gaze, Robert seemed to actually see her. "My father," she began, then faltered. The shame of being cast out burned fresh. He said I was a burden, that I brought nothing but misfortune to the ranch. Her voice trembled despite her efforts to sound strong. After I refused to marry David Martins, he decided I wasn't worth keeping around. Robert stopped abruptly, causing his horse to whicker in protest. His expression transformed from curiosity to genuine distress. He put you out? His own daughter? The rancher's brow furrowed deeply, creating lines that spoke of a man who felt things strongly. Mary nodded, heat rising to her cheeks. He gave me until sundown to leave. She clutched her worn satchel tighter, the meager contents representing everything she owned in the world. That's not right, Robert said firmly, his jaw tightening. Family is supposed to stand together, especially in hard times. He shook his head, clearly troubled. William Johnson always was a proud man, but this... He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. Mary swallowed hard, fighting back tears. The drought hit us badly. We lost half our cattle last season. He needed someone to blame. And you were convenient, Robert finished softly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've known men like your father, the kind who can't bend without breaking, but taking it out on his own flesh and blood. He shook his head again. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of her situation hanging between them. Mary felt strangely lighter having shared her burden, even with this near stranger. There was something about Robert Brown that inspired trust, despite her better judgment. Well, Robert finally said, his voice gentler now, seems to me Silver Creek just gained someone valuable, even if your father was too blind to see it. He offered a small, encouraging smile that reached his eyes. Shall we continue? Town's still a fair piece ahead. Robert Brown insisted Mary ride his horse into town, but she hesitated, her fingers tightening around the worn leather satchel. The kindness of strangers wasn't something she'd come to trust, especially from a man she barely knew. I couldn't possibly, she protested, though her feet throbbed inside her dusty boots. Hours of walking under the Colorado sun had left blisters she was too proud to mention. Miss Johnson, it's another 4 miles to Silver Creek, Robert said, his voice gentle but firm. There's no sense in you collapsing before you even reach town. Mary weighed her options. Pride had its place, but practicality mattered more when you had nowhere to go and night would eventually fall. The chestnut horse nickered softly, as if encouraging her decision. I suppose you're right, she finally conceded. Before she could change her mind, Robert stepped forward and carefully helped her onto the saddle. His hands were strong but respectful as he steadied her, then took the reins to lead the horse on foot. Thank you, Mary said quietly, adjusting her skirts. The elevation gave her a new perspective of the landscape. Rolling hills dotted with scrub brush, the distant mountains framing the horizon. As they continued toward town, Robert glanced up at her. So what brings you to Silver Creek? Family there? Mary shook her head. Work, I hope. I met Mrs. Wilson once at a county fair. She mentioned needing help at her boarding house. Robert's expression shifted slightly. I don't mean to discourage you, but I was in town yesterday. I heard Mrs. Wilson just hired someone else. The town's grown considerably since the new mine opened. Mary's heart sank. The boarding house had been her only solid prospect. Are you certain? Not entirely, he admitted. But Silver Creek's changed. More miners, more businesses. Mrs. Wilson might have all the help she needs now. Mary swallowed hard, fighting back the panic rising in her throat. She hadn't considered what she'd do if her one plan failed. The little money she had wouldn't last more than a night or two. Perhaps there are other opportunities, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Robert nodded. There usually are, for those willing to work hard. He paused, studying the road ahead. And you strike me as someone who isn't afraid of hard work, Miss Johnson. Despite her uncertainty, Mary felt a small spark of hope at his words. The horse's steady gait carried her forward, toward whatever awaited in Silver Creek, whether opportunity or disappointment. Mary's heart sank like a stone in a well. The boarding house had been her only real plan, and now that door was closing before she even had a chance to knock. She stared at the dusty road ahead, mentally tallying her meager savings, barely enough for a night's lodging and a meal. "There's always work at the Double B," Robert Brown offered, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Costa, has been complaining for months that she needs help, and the ranch hands need feeding. 20 hungry cowboys can't be satisfied by one woman's cooking, no matter how talented she is." Mary hesitated, her fingers tightening around the worn leather strap of her satchel. In Silver Creek, as in any frontier town, reputations were fragile things for young women. Working at a ranch owned by an unmarried man would set tongues wagging faster than a prairie fire in August. She'd seen how quickly whispers could turn to judgment. "I appreciate the offer, but," she began, choosing her words carefully. Robert seemed to read her thoughts. A knowing smile crossed his face as he adjusted his hat. "Mrs. Costa's a force of nature," he chuckled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "Been with the Double B since before I inherited it. She rules that kitchen like a general, and your reputation would be safer with her around than anywhere in town." Mary considered his words. The housekeeper sounded formidable, perhaps the maternal figure she'd been missing since her mother's passing. Still, caution kept her silent. "She's 63, goes to church 3 times a week, and has 7 grandchildren in Denver," Robert added. "When she's not cooking, she's writing letters to them or telling anyone who'll listen about their achievements." Despite herself, Mary smiled. "She sounds remarkable." "That she is. And truthfully," Robert continued, lowering his voice, "the ranch is doing well enough that I can offer fair wages, better than you'd get at the boarding house. Private room too." The practical side of Mary's nature couldn't ignore this. With proper wages, she could save money, perhaps eventually afford passage somewhere else, somewhere far from her father's shadow and the painful memories of rejection. "I could try it," she said carefully. "For a short while, at least." Robert nodded, respecting her caution. "That's all I ask. If it doesn't suit, I'll personally ensure you find something in town that does." Mary took a deep breath. Sometimes survival meant taking chances. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Brown." "Robert," he corrected with a smile. "Everyone at the Double B is on a first-name basis, except Mrs. Costa, of course. She's earned the right to formality." "I'll try the boarding house first," Mary decided, though she had little hope left. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her shoulders as they approached Silver Creek. The small town bustled with more activity than she remembered, miners and traders filling the streets as the sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Robert Brown guided his chestnut horse through the main street, nodding at familiar faces while Mary tried to make herself smaller in the saddle. Curious glances followed them. A young woman riding with the Double B ranch owner was bound to start whispers. She clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, everything she owned now contained in this single bag. When they reached the boarding house, a neat 2-story building with white trim and flower boxes, Robert helped her down. His hands were strong but gentle on her waist, and Mary felt a flush of warmth rise to her cheeks despite her exhaustion. "Mrs. Wilson is fair-minded," he said quietly. "Even if she can't help, she might know of other opportunities." Mary smoothed her dusty dress, wishing she looked more presentable. The door opened after the second knock, revealing a plump woman with kind eyes that widened in recognition. "Mary Johnson, is that you, dear?" Mrs. Wilson asked, her gaze darting between Mary and Robert. "Yes, ma'am," Mary replied. "I was hoping about that position we discussed at the fair." Mrs. Wilson's face fell, genuine regret crossing her features. "I'm sorry, dear. I just filled the position yesterday. A widow from Denver arrived with her boy." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "Maybe the saloon is hiring, but I wouldn't send a girl like you there." Mary's stomach knotted. The saloon meant serving drinks to rowdy miners, fending off wandering hands, and ruining what little reputation she had left. Before she could respond, Robert stepped forward. "My offer still stands," he said firmly. "Mrs. Costa would be delighted to have help at the Double B." Mrs. Wilson's expression brightened immediately. "The Double B is a respectable place," she assured Mary. "Mrs. Costa's known throughout the county for her propriety. No one would think twice about you working there." Mary hesitated, weighing her dwindling options. Night was falling rapidly. She had barely any money and couldn't afford a room. The thought of sleeping in the stables or begging for charity made her stomach churn. "If you're sure Mrs. Costa needs help," she said softly, looking up at Robert. "She's been after me for months," Robert assured her, a genuine smile warming his face. "Says running that kitchen alone is like feeding an army with one pan." Mrs. Wilson's weathered face brightened considerably at the mention of the Double B Ranch. "Robert's place is quite respectable," she assured Mary, her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "And Mrs. Costa is known throughout the county for her strict propriety. No one would question your virtue there." Mary Johnson glanced down at her worn boots, weighing her dwindling options. Night was already falling over Silver Creek, painting the dusty main street in long shadows. The boarding house had been her only real hope, and without work, she couldn't afford even the cheapest room in town. The thought of sleeping outdoors sent a shiver down her spine. She'd heard stories of what happened to young women alone after dark. "If you're sure Mrs. Costa truly needs help," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the distant piano notes drifting from the saloon. Robert Brown's face broke into a reassuring grin, the kind that reached his eyes. "She's been after me for months to find her assistance," he explained. "Says she's getting too old to manage the entire household alone, especially with the ranch hands increasing for the summer season." Mrs. Wilson patted Mary's arm gently. "You could do far worse than the Double B, dear. Robert here has a reputation as a fair employer." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And between us, that Mrs. Costa would tan the hide of any man who stepped out of line around her girls." This brought a small, hesitant smile to Mary's lips. With a deep breath that seemed to carry the weight of her father's rejection, she nodded her acceptance. "I'd be grateful for the opportunity," she said, straightening her shoulders with what little dignity she could muster. Minutes later, Mary found herself perched once again atop Robert's chestnut horse, her worn leather satchel secured behind the saddle. The rancher walked alongside, leading the animal by its reins as they headed north out of town. The fading daylight cast long shadows across the trail, and the distant silhouette of mountains framed the horizon. Despite her exhaustion, Mary couldn't help but feel her stomach flutter with nerves. She was placing her fate in the hands of a man she'd just met, heading toward an unknown future at the Double B. Yet something about Robert's steady presence and direct gaze made her want to trust him, despite everything her life had taught her about men's promises. As Silver Creek disappeared behind them, Mary watched the trail ahead unfold in the gathering dusk, wondering what tomorrow would bring at a ranch she'd only heard mentioned in passing conversations. The Double B Ranch materialized on the horizon like a painting come to life, its sprawling acreage impressive even in the fading light. Mary Johnson's eyes widened at the sight of the well-maintained. Robert dismounted smoothly, offering a hand to help Mary down. "Mrs. Costa, this is Mary Johnson. She's looking for work. William Johnson's daughter," he added, his tone conveying volumes to the housekeeper. The older woman's stern expression softened immediately as she took in Mary's pale face and the tight grip she maintained on her worn leather satchel. Recognition flickered in her eyes at the mention of William Johnson. Clearly, his reputation had reached even here. "Come in, dear," Mrs. Costa said, her voice gentling as she approached. "You look ready to drop where you stand." She shot Robert a questioning glance, but didn't wait for further explanation before taking Mary's arm. "Supper's on the stove, and there's plenty to go around." Mary hesitated, overwhelmed by the sudden kindness after a day of emotional upheaval. I don't want to impose. Nonsense, Mrs. Costa interrupted, already guiding her toward the house. No one stands hungry on the porch of the Double B. That's one of our rules, isn't it, Robert? The rancher nodded, taking his horse's reins. First rule of the Double B, he confirmed with a gentle smile. I'll just see to thunder here and be right in. The warmth emanating from the ranch house pulled Mary forward like a beacon. The scent of fresh bread and something savory drifted through the open door, making her stomach clench painfully with hunger. As Mrs. Costa ushered her inside, Mary felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother died, the sensation of being genuinely welcomed. The warmth of the ranch house enveloped Mary Johnson like a forgotten embrace. After hours on the dusty road, the Double B's kitchen felt like stepping into another world. Oil lamps cast a golden glow over the worn wooden table, and the aroma of fresh bread and hearty beef stew made her stomach growl so loudly she blushed. Mrs. Costa bustled around her, pulling out a chair and ladling a generous portion into a bowl. Sit, child. You look ready to collapse. The housekeeper's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as she sliced thick pieces of bread and set them beside the steaming stew. When did you last eat properly? Mrs. Costa asked, her sharp eyes taking in Mary's thin frame. Breakfast, Mary admitted, embarrassed by both her hunger and circumstances. She didn't add that breakfast had been merely a heel of stale bread before her father had thrown her belongings onto the porch. The first spoonful of stew nearly brought tears to her eyes. Rich broth, tender beef, and vegetables from what must be the ranch's kitchen garden. Mary forced herself to eat slowly, though her body demanded she devour everything in seconds. Tell me what happened, Mrs. Costa urged, settling across from her with a cup of coffee. How does a young lady end up walking alone on that dangerous road? Mary carefully measured her words, softening the harsh reality. My father's ranch has been struggling. The drought hit us hard. She omitted William Johnson's cruel words, how he'd called her worthless and blamed her for their misfortune. How he'd thrown her mother's photograph against the wall when she refused to marry David Martins. Despite her careful editing, Mrs. Costa's face darkened with each word. The older woman's hands tightened around her coffee cup until her knuckles whitened. Your father put you out? Without even a horse? Her voice rose with indignation. His own flesh and blood. Sent away on foot? Mary stared at her bowl, shame burning her cheeks. He said I brought bad luck. Nonsense, Mrs. Costa declared, reaching across to pat Mary's hand. Absolute nonsense. From the doorway came Robert's quiet voice. Hard times change a man, but it's no excuse. Mary looked up to find him leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. The ranch owner's blue eyes held no pity, only a steady understanding that somehow hurt worse than condemnation. Some men forget what matters when life gets difficult, Robert continued, his voice gentle but firm. But family should always come first. Mary swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. For the first time since her mother died, she felt seen, not as a burden, but as someone worth protecting. Mrs. Costa insisted Mary stay at the Double B Ranch for as long as she needed. Her weathered hands rested firmly on her hips as she made the declaration, brooking no argument. The older woman's eyes held a warmth that Mary hadn't experienced since her mother's passing. I can cook, clean, and keep accounts, Mary Johnson offered, her voice barely above a whisper. The gratitude that welled inside her chest was almost overwhelming. After being cast out by her own father, this unexpected kindness from strangers left her feeling both vulnerable and relieved. Perfect, Mrs. Costa beamed, her stern features softening into a maternal smile. That's exactly what we need around here. She gestured for Mary to follow her up a narrow staircase to the second floor of the ranch house. The housekeeper led her down a short hallway to a modest but clean bedroom. This will be your room, she announced, pushing the door open wide. The space was simple but inviting. a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small dresser, and a washstand beneath a window that overlooked the corral. "It's lovely," Mary breathed, taking in the sight of her new sanctuary. Through the window, she could see ranch hands moving about in the fading light, leading horses to the stable for the night. The scene was so different from her father's struggling property. Mrs. Costa patted her shoulder. "Get some rest, dear. We rise early here." With that, she left Mary alone with her thoughts and her meager possessions. After unpacking her worn leather satchel, which took mere minutes given how little she owned, Mary changed into her only other nightgown. The cotton was thin from countless washings, but clean and familiar against her skin. She placed her mother's pocket knife carefully on the small bedside table, the one keepsake that connected her to happier times. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, Mary stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. The morning had begun with her father's cruel dismissal, his face contorted with disappointment as he called her worthless. Now she found herself in a stranger's home, taken in through an act of kindness she couldn't quite trust. Despite her homelessness, a curious feeling settled over her: safety. For the first time in years, she didn't need to tiptoe around William Johnson's volatile moods or endure his cutting remarks. The realization brought tears to her eyes. How strange that she felt more secure under Robert Brown's roof after a single day than she had for years in her childhood home. As sleep finally began to claim her, Mary wondered what tomorrow would bring at the Double B Ranch and whether this unexpected refuge might become something more permanent. As Mary settled into her modest bed, her thoughts drifted to Robert Brown and his unexpected kindness. Throughout her life, she'd learned the hard way to question men's intentions. Her father's coldness had taught her that lesson, and David Martin's unwelcome advances had reinforced it. Yet there was something disarmingly genuine about Robert's steady blue eyes that made her want to lower her guard. "This is just work," she whispered to herself in the darkness, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Nothing more. She couldn't afford to misinterpret his generosity as anything deeper. The young ranch owner had simply needed help, and she needed employment. A fortunate coincidence, nothing else. Mary tucked away the tiny flutter in her chest whenever he entered a room, burying that dangerous hope deep down as she drifted into sleep. Morning arrived with the distinctive sounds of ranch life: roosters crowing, horses nickering in the corral, and the distant calls of ranch hands beginning their day. Sunlight streamed through the small window of her room, painting golden patterns across the wooden floor. For a moment, Mary forgot her circumstances, the peace of this new place washing over her. She dressed quickly in her simple work dress, pinning her hair neatly before making her way to the kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee greeted her before she even reached the doorway. Mrs. Costa was already at work, her plump hands kneading a large mound of dough with practiced efficiency. A streak of flour dusted her gray hair, giving her the appearance of having aged overnight. The housekeeper looked up with a warm smile. "There you are, dear. Sleep well?" Mary nodded, tying an apron around her waist. "Better than I have in years." "Good. Now it's time to start breakfast," Mrs. Costa instructed, gesturing toward the pantry. "Bacon, eggs, coffee will feed a dozen hungry men this morning. Ranch hands don't work well on empty stomachs." Mary set to work immediately, grateful for the familiar tasks. Her mother had taught her to cook from an early age, and the routine brought comfort. As she sliced thick cuts of bacon and cracked eggs into a large bowl, she realized she felt more at home in Miss Kitchen after one night than she had at her father's ranch for years. "The men start early and work hard," Mrs. Costa explained, sliding the dough into pans. "Robert expects a lot, but he's fair. Never asks more of others than he asks of himself." Mary nodded, wondering what the day would bring in this new life that had appeared so unexpectedly before her. Mary fell into the rhythm of kitchen work with surprising ease. Her mother's lessons from years past guided her hands as she kneaded dough and chopped vegetables alongside Mrs. Costa. The familiar motions brought comfort. A small connection to happier times before her mother's passing had left her alone with William Johnson's bitterness. "You've got skilled hands," Mrs. Costa observed, watching Mary efficiently slice potatoes for the midday meal. "Your mother taught you well." Mary nodded, a small smile touching her lips. She believed every woman should know how to run a household properly, no matter her station. As they worked side by side in the warm kitchen, the older woman shared stories about the Double B Ranch and its young owner. Her voice carried pride as she spoke of Robert's accomplishments. "This place was half the size when his uncle owned it," Mrs. Costa explained, gesturing broadly toward the window where ranch hands could be seen moving cattle in the distance. "Robert inherited it when he was barely 21. Everyone thought he'd fail. Too young, they said." Mary glanced up from the bacon sizzling in the cast-iron skillet. "What happened instead?" "He doubled its size within 3 years," Mrs. Costa replied, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "And that's not all. When the drought hit 2 summers ago, he helped every struggling neighbor who asked. Loaned cattle, shared water rights, extended credit at the general store to families who couldn't pay." Mary flipped the bacon strips carefully, considering this information against her own father's harsh response to hardship. William had only grown more isolated and bitter when times turned difficult, pushing away neighbors who might have helped. "He seems young for all this responsibility," Mary remarked, thinking of Robert's confident manner and steady blue eyes. Mrs. Costa nodded, measuring coffee grounds into the large pot. "He's wise beyond his years, that one. Lost his parents when he was 14. Influenza took them both within a week of each other. After that, he worked every job on this ranch before he owned a single acre of it. Started as a stable boy, then cowhand, then foreman." The housekeeper's voice softened. "Never saw a young man with such determination. He learned every aspect of ranching from the ground up. That's why the men respect him so. He won't ask anyone to do work he hasn't done himself." Mary absorbed this information, finding herself increasingly curious about the man who had offered her refuge when her own blood had cast her out. There was more to Robert Brown than she had initially understood, a depth of character that explained the loyalty he inspired in everyone, from Mrs. Costa to the roughest cowhand. Robert Brown entered the kitchen, already dressed in his work clothes, a clean flannel shirt tucked into worn jeans. The morning sun caught the gold flecks in his blue eyes as he surveyed the bustling kitchen. "Mornin', ladies." "Something smells wonderful," he said, his voice carrying that gentle authority Mary had come to recognize. She kept her eyes down, focusing intently on the biscuits she was arranging, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. Her cheeks warmed without permission, and she silently scolded herself for the reaction. Mrs. Costa noticed the exchange and quickly established boundaries as the ranch hands began filing in for breakfast. "You boys remember, we have a lady working here now," she announced firmly, hands on her hips. "I expect every one of you to treat Miss Johnson with the same respect you'd show your own sisters." The men nodded, some tipping their hats toward Mary with shy smiles. She appreciated the housekeeper's protection. It reminded her of how her mother once stood up for her when her father's moods turned dark. After the men had eaten and headed out to their morning chores, Mrs. Costa gave Mary a proper tour of the sprawling ranch house. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, with 6 bedrooms upstairs, a study lined with books, and a formal dining room rarely used except for special occasions. "This place needs a woman's touch," the older woman confided, running her finger along a dusty shelf. "I do what I can, but these men track in half the territory with them." She explained Mary's duties in detail, helping with 3 meals daily for the ranch hands, cleaning the main living areas, managing the laundry for the house linens, and Mrs. Costa paused here with a knowing look. Robert mentioned you might be good with figures? Mary nodded. My mother insisted I learn more than just cooking and sewing. She taught me bookkeeping before she passed. Perfect! Mrs. Costa clapped her hands together. Robert could use help with the ranch accounts and correspondence. He's brilliant with cattle and land, but those ledgers give him headaches. As they passed the study, Mary glimpsed stacks of papers on a large oak desk. The thought of organizing them made her fingers itch with anticipation, a task where she could truly prove her worth beyond household chores. I'd be happy to help with the accounts, she said, more confident than she'd felt in months. Mrs. Costa smiled approvingly. That's settled then. You'll help me in the mornings and evenings, and afternoons you can work in here. She patted Mary's arm. Just remember, you're staff now, not family. Keep things proper with the boss. Mary nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. No matter how kind Robert's eyes or how gentle his manner, she was here to work, nothing more. Mary Johnson smiled as she dipped her pen in the inkwell, carefully recording the latest cattle sale in the ledger. Though her father had dismissed her as worthless, her mother had insisted on teaching her more than the usual womanly arts. A woman with numbers in her head will never go hungry, her mother used to say, and those lessons were proving invaluable now. These figures don't match what we paid last month, Mary noted, showing Robert the discrepancy in the supply costs. The young ranch owner leaned over her shoulder, his presence warm but respectful as he studied the page. You've got a keen eye, he said, appreciatively. I've been overpaying for feed since winter. Within weeks, Mary had reorganized the ranch's bookkeeping system, implemented a detailed inventory for supplies, and drafted letters to negotiate better prices with merchants in town. The Double B's finances improved noticeably, and Robert began consulting her on business decisions that would have been unthinkable at her father's table. Where did you learn all this? Robert asked one evening as they finished the monthly accounts by lamplight. My mother, she replied softly. She managed our books before she passed. Father never knew. He thought women had no head for business. Mrs. Costa watched their growing partnership with approval, often leaving them to work together in the study after dinner. That girl's worth her weight in gold, the housekeeper told Robert when Mary was out of earshot. Smart as a whip and twice as useful. As spring blossomed across the prairie, Mary found herself settling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly like home. Mornings began with helping Mrs. Costa prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, followed by household duties and afternoons spent with the account books. The older woman taught her to make proper bread and shared stories of her homeland, while Mary introduced new organizational systems for the pantry and linens. Each evening, after the work was done, Mary would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Sometimes Robert joined her, their conversations flowing easily from ranch matters to books they'd read and places they hoped to see. For the first time since her mother's death, Mary felt truly seen. The ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when she passed. Mrs. Costa beamed with pride at her accomplishments, and Robert, his blue eyes followed her with something more than mere appreciation for her work. The Double B had become more than employment. It was sanctuary. In this place, with these people, Mary discovered a sense of belonging that William Johnson's bitter household had never provided. She was valued here, not for what she could bring a husband, but for her mind, her skills, and herself. 2 weeks passed like a gentle breeze at the Double B Ranch. Mary Johnson had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. The ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when she brought lunch to the fields, and Mrs. Costa beamed with pride as Mary mastered the household accounts with remarkable efficiency. One evening, as Mary sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Colorado sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Robert Brown approached with an unusual heaviness in his step. His blue eyes, normally bright with optimism, carried a shadow she hadn't seen before. "Mary," he said softly, settling beside her on the wooden bench, "I was in town today and heard some news you should know." He removed his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. Your father sold the ranch to the Silver Creek Mining Company and took the first train to California yesterday. The words hit Mary like a physical blow. The small ranch, her childhood home where her mother had planted wildflowers along the fence and taught her to read by lamplight, was gone. The land that should have been her inheritance, meager as it was, had been sold without a word to her. "Everything?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening chorus of crickets. Robert nodded, his expression gentle with understanding. "The deed was transferred yesterday. They're planning to expand mining operations onto the property." Mary turned away, blinking rapidly as tears threatened to spill. William Johnson had erased the last connection between them as easily as crossing out a line in his ledger. The finality of it burned in her chest. "I know it wasn't much," she said finally, "but it was all I had left of my mother." Robert's hand found hers, warm and steady. "You have a place here as long as you want it," he told her with quiet conviction. "Mrs. Costa told me just yesterday you're the daughter she never had." Mary looked up, surprised by the emotion in his eyes. "And you're worth more than all your father's land," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger. "Anyone can see that. Your kindness with the ranch hands, your clever mind with the accounts, you've brought something to this place we didn't even know was missing." A single tear escaped, despite Mary's efforts, tracking down her cheek. Robert reached out tentatively, then seemed to think better of it, returning his hand to his lap. "Thank you," Mary whispered, finding strength in his words, "for giving me a chance when my own blood wouldn't." As twilight deepened around them, Mary realized that perhaps losing her past might be the first step toward finding her future. Robert's words echoed in Mary Johnson's mind for days afterward. "You're worth more than all your father's land." No one had ever valued her for herself before, not William Johnson, who saw her only as a burden, nor the townsfolk who pitied the motherless girl. Those simple words planted a seed of self-worth that began to flourish as spring transformed the Colorado prairie. As the landscape burst into wildflowers and green grass, Mary's confidence blossomed similarly. Her ledgers were impeccable, her organizational system saving the ranch considerable money. Mrs. Costa beamed with pride when showing visitors "my girl's work," as if Mary were her own daughter. When influenza swept through Silver Creek, Mary revealed another talent. She remembered her mother's herbal remedies and nursed 3 ranch hands back to health with mustard plasters and willow bark tea. The men recovered faster than others in town, cementing her place in the ranch's tight-knit community. "You've got healing hands," Mrs. Costa declared one evening, patting Mary's arm affectionately. "Just like your mother must have had." Mary's weekly trips to town for supplies gradually yielded friendships. The general store owner's wife invited her to join a sewing circle, while the blacksmith's daughter sought her advice on bookkeeping. These connections healed something broken inside her, the isolation her father had imposed through his bitterness. But it was the evenings with Robert that Mary treasured most. After supper, when Mrs. Costa retired to her room with her knitting, they would sit by the fire, discussing everything from cattle prices to poetry. Robert had a small library inherited from his uncle, and Mary devoured each volume eagerly. "I've never met anyone who thinks like you do," he told her one night as they debated a passage from Emerson. The firelight caught the blue of his eyes, making them sparkle with admiration. Their conversations flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences that spoke volumes. Sometimes their hands would brush as they reached for the same book, sending warmth through Mary that had nothing to do with the hearth fire. She found herself noticing small things: how he always hung his hat on the third peg, the way his brow furrowed when reading correspondence, how he hummed softly while thinking. Mary tried to dismiss these observations, reminding herself of her position. Yet each morning, she found herself taking extra care with her appearance before breakfast. "You're blooming like the prairie," Mrs. Costa observed with a knowing smile. It suits you. Mary only blushed in response, unwilling to name the feelings taking root in her heart. The spring air carried the scent of wildflowers as Mary Johnson walked along the fence line of the Double B Ranch. 3 months had passed since that fateful day when her father had cast her out. The pain had dulled, replaced by something she hadn't expected to find: purpose. Robert Brown approached, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He carried 2 cups of coffee, steam rising in the cool evening air. Mary accepted one with a smile, their fingers brushing briefly. "The new calves are doing well," she said, leaning against the fence. "Mrs. Costa says we'll have the best herd in the territory by fall." Robert nodded, his blue eyes studying her face. "You've transformed this place, Mary. The books are in order, the house runs smoothly, and even the hands work harder when you're around." Mary felt warmth spread across her cheeks. She had grown comfortable here, found strength in being valued for her mind, rather than merely as someone's daughter or potential wife. "I received a letter today," Robert said, his voice growing serious. "Your father's land has been completely cleared. The mining company wasted no time." Mary gazed toward the distant hills where she'd grown up. "Strange how it doesn't hurt as much anymore." "You deserved better," Robert said softly. He set his cup down and turned to face her fully. "Mary, I need to tell you something." Her heart quickened as he took her hands in his. "These past months, watching you rebuild your life, seeing your strength and kindness, I've come to care for you deeply." Mary held her breath, afraid to hope. "I don't want you to stay as my employee anymore," he continued, and for a moment, her world threatened to crumble again. Then Robert smiled. "You offer more than you know. Your kindness, strength, and intelligence mean more to me than any land or dowry. I want you as my partner, in every sense." Tears welled in Mary's eyes. "People will say you took in a homeless girl and—" "Let them talk," he interrupted. "Mrs. Costa already considers you family. The hands respect you. And he paused, "I love you." The words hung between them, precious and fragile. "I never thought I'd find this," Mary whispered. "Someone who sees me, not what I can provide or what I lack." With gentle care, Robert pulled her close. Their first kiss was tender, a promise of all that might be. With love, forgiveness, and second chances, Mary built a new life at the Double B Ranch, a life richer than she could ever have imagined, with a man who saw her worth from the very start. The burden her father claimed she'd been had transformed into the blessing Robert treasured every day.